Hey, good afternoon. We're just waiting for the last few people to trickle in. We got 7 people in the room. We're waiting for about 5 more, 6 more. There's 8. So once everybody's in, or once most people are in, we'll start. Hello, Nikita. 9 people, so 3 more. Gary, welcome. Diana, welcome. Hey, Derek. 10 people. I'm sure a few people are sitting or finishing their last meeting, so we'll wait just a couple minutes before starting. 2 people left. Gary, I'll invite you on screen so that you can help moderate. Two people left. Hello, Arlene. Vikram, welcome. So while we wait maybe 2 more minutes, just wanted to know what is the single most important thing you'd like to learn today over the course of the next 2 days? What is the thing, if you could learn one thing about Access or how to improve something in your migrations, what would it be? If you could just type it into the chat, it gives me a sense of where you're coming from. Nothing so far. Everyone knows Access already, or they have open minds maybe. Okay, let's give people 1 more minute and then we'll start. Yeah, there's a 12th person, so we have only one person missing. Okay, let's start. So welcome, thank you all for being here. My name is Alex. Alexander is what I write in any document, but Alexander is far too formal. Please just call me Alex. Oh, we have an answer. More efficient way of uploading client master data, utilizing, right. Yeah, that's typically the most challenging issue. Okay, great. Thank you for that answer, or that question, or that comment. So we're here over the next day and on Thursday to go through what Access can do for you in terms of data migrations. It's a super powerful tool. I'm really happy to be able to share this with you today. I do find that sometimes I get very excited, especially about these topics I'm very passionate about, and my brain sometimes travels way too quickly and my mouth struggles to catch up, and I might struggle or catch myself with a few words. So if there's any moment where you'd like me to go deeper in a particular topic, or I'm not clear about something, please let me know and I'll address that. So let's move then to the presentation. Sharing my screen. Cool. How to migrate data into Salesforce using Access. So just to know what the agenda is for the next couple of days, today we'll talk about mostly tables. So how to get data from your legacy system, whether it's a legacy system or another Salesforce org, into tables, which are the source of all the data in Microsoft Access. Then how to build queries and how to use queries to analyze your data, to be able to transform your data as necessary. And there's some basic data manipulation you can do with queries. There are certain things that joins that would replace VLOOKUPs, and there are some really cool wizards we can leverage as well. And then we'll end the day by talking about how to actually import and export from Salesforce. And I'll talk about the entire process of how we go from Access into Salesforce. On Thursday, we'll talk about more advanced ways of manipulating data using code, because what's great about Access is that it has its own scripting language. It's something called VBA, which is similar to Excel. Actually, it's mostly the same, actually. But the idea is that it's a lot more useful in Access. It does require a bit of knowledge about how to program, but as long as you know at least one programming language, you'll find VBA very easy to use. It's a very lenient, very lazy language. Then we'll talk about some large data sets, and I'm not talking about big data here. Big data I consider to be terabytes of information, but as long as we're talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of records, Access can handle it. There are some caveats to that. It's not just necessarily with Access, because Access itself does have some limitations. We'll get to that later. And then part of this exercise, part of this whole webinar is to be interactive, right? It's not just for me to blah, blah about the entire time. It's to get questions from you. I'm even open to getting some use cases from you that you can either email to me or we can talk about here, and then I can present the solution to them on Thursday. In terms of logistics, so the way that this Crowdcast software works, you have basically two ways of interacting with me. The first one is ask a question. So you can pose a question, and then at certain moments, I'll ask Gary to help dictate what those messages are, what those questions are, and I'll have the pleasure of answering them. And you can chat as well on the bottom right, more of a dialogue, casual conversation, getting feedback from you and having conversations with each other. So really, I'm encouraging this to make sure you guys get the full benefit of it, so it's not just a presentation style. In order for you guys to gain the most benefit of this, I know it might be difficult, but I ask that you turn off your phone and put away your emails because it's easy to get distracted. And I've really tried my best to make this webinar as concise as possible. I try to keep to all the juicy details, remove any kind of fluff. So if you miss a few things, you might get lost along the way or not at least benefit from all of it. But of course, the whole thing is being recorded so that once this webinar is finished, you guys will receive a copy of it to review at your leisure. And if ever there's a question that you don't have time for to type in, or you want to ask a longer question, or you want to offer a video to help explain what your scenario is, please email it to me. And like I said, I'll try to present it to you on Thursday, or even after this webinar is finished. I'm available for questions and comments after for the next few days, few weeks. So please take advantage of that when you can. Yeah, and so Gary is going to be joining us, or has joined us. He's my colleague. He'll be help moderating the questions and the chat. And I know a few of you guys at The Absolute know Gary already, so thank you, Gary, for being here as well. Okay, so a little bit about who I am, just so you know, I'm a credible source. I've been doing Access for quite a while. It's actually, I first started using Access way back in version 1.0, and that was back in 1992, which kind of tells you how old I am. And it was for a summer job. I was hired at a software engineering company, and they asked me to build a defect tracking tool using Microsoft Access. And up until that point, I've never even heard of it. I didn't really know what a database was, but I was really intrigued by it. I found it really cool to use. Even though it had some very basic functions and limited functionality, I was able to do quite a bit with it. But in general, I found that summer job to be uninteresting. So the other thing I discovered about myself during that time in summer is that if I can prop myself up in a certain way on the chair and position a book right in front of me, I'm actually able to, or I was able to, put my head to one side and fall asleep. And I would take naps during the summer vacation or summer work. And it was great up until the point where I realized I lost spatial awareness. And there were some colleagues of mine that came around and actually watched me sleep. So it was a bit embarrassing, but I thought that was a funny story to share. When I told my wife about this webinar and how I wanted to share a quick story about how I knew Access, and I told her the exact story I just told you now, she's asked me if I had a better story to share. I guess it wasn't so funny for her, but anyway, I found it amusing. So that being said, I've done a few Access databases in my time because it doesn't do just database crunching. We're going to be focusing mostly on, of course, the part of Salesforce or the part of Access used for Salesforce. But there's so much more that it can do. Not only is it a database itself, but it also has a front end. It has places where you can create forms, which are like page layouts. You can create reports and all kinds of really good stuff. But we're going to be focusing mostly on the next couple of days on the tables and the queries. And the code, of course, as well. Cool. Okay, So the first thing I wanted to mention was why Excel is bad, specifically for transforming data for Salesforce. And the main reason is because Access acts on your behalf. It thinks it knows what you're trying to do and interprets the data that you are giving it. So if I were to take a CSV file that you see on the left, the original CSV file, and I just open it with Excel, save, and close, you can see the resulting CSV looks very different. It strips away the zeros, and it interprets the dashes to be dates. And this is obviously nothing what it looked like at the beginning, and it can cause a lot of confusion. I mean, dates in general are an issue in Salesforce in making sure that the date format works properly. But it doesn't help that you have this system working on your behalf. In addition to that, VLOOKUPs are very complicated. I find it's okay if you have maybe one VLOOKUP to join kind of join two tables or two sheets together. But the minute you need to have more than one VLOOKUP, Excel really shows its colors and its limitations. Why Access is good. So it was designed to be a database. You can use it entirely as a database and nothing more, which is fantastic. So it has all the relationships that you could ever want between tables. Whenever you're uploading or inserting data into Access, you also determine what is the data type, just like you would in Salesforce, to giving you full control over how you want to look at and analyze and perceive the data. There's a lot of things you can do with clicks, not code, just like the Salesforce mantra. So a lot of drag and drop stuff where you don't need any programming knowledge whatsoever, and you can accomplish quite a bit, especially for the lookups, like I said, and analyzing data, which I'll show you in an example. And the fact that it has some duplication wizards, one that I use very often to be able to find duplicate data, not across just necessarily one field, but a whole bunch of fields. Again, really, really powerful stuff, not very complicated to use. And then the VBA language, if you really want to go one step deeper, there hasn't been a situation or a data migration that I have not been able to do with Access. And I've done one for some major clients with lots of data where I had to fully transform how they do, in this case, it was donations, from a whole different way of doing it into opportunities in Salesforce. I can't imagine using anything else besides Access. And there are more powerful tools out there. There are ETL tools, Talent and so forth. And those are great if it's an ongoing implementation. If you have an ongoing connection between two systems, one of which is Salesforce, then a middleware makes total sense. Boomi, for example, is another one I like very much. But if it's a one-time data migration, if you're just loading data from a legacy system into Salesforce, then these tools are overly complicated and overly priced. What I like about Access, of course, is that it's part of the Office 365 and fairly reasonable price-wise to be able to use. And again, the learning curve is quite low. So I'll do my best to do a mind meld of everything that I know about Access to you today. And hopefully you guys will be able to handle data migrations on your own this point forward. And getting back to that joins, this is something I've actually done. This is a join that I've done, or a table, a query that I've done with multiple tables. And I could not even possibly imagine how you could do this in Excel. And this was taking from data from a legacy organization, Salesforce org, to a new one. So I had to map users like owner IDs, created by, modified by. I had to change the contacts, accounts, and so forth. So, really, really, really complicated stuff. But it's very feasible to do in Access that in Excel I can't imagine. A bit about some of the tools that I use, just to give you guys some more color about how I do my day-to-day work when I'm dealing with data migrations. So obviously Access, you need that to start. Because you can't use Access to load data directly into Salesforce, at least for the version that I'm using, you need a data loader of some kind. I know that there is an enterprise version of Microsoft Access, which does allow some kind of connector between the two, but I've never used it, so I can't make any comment about it. So the idea is that you're using Access to basically transform, analyze data, whether it came from a legacy system or even in its own, from its own Salesforce instance. I have, for example, decided where a report doesn't cut it, or I want to analyze data much more complex, in a much more complex nature. Rather than build a complicated report, I would just export the various objects into Access, do my transformations, do my reporting, do my analysis, and then, if necessary, import the results back into Salesforce. So you do need a data loader of some kind. I do like Salesforce Data Loader because it's free and it has some great benefits and features to it. but there's also Jitterbit, which I use from time to time. For Notepad, I prefer something a bit more complicated than the general Notepad that comes with Windows, at least. So I purchased the Edit Plus version of a Notepad. I know there's Notepad++ and a few other tools out there. The idea is that when you're dealing with larger files, you most likely will want something a little more advanced than a simple Notepad, which has size limitations and has a hard time opening up larger files, especially CSV files. When dealing with large data sets, you have, as I mentioned, or I will mention, two options. One of them is to use multiple instances of Access, but the other one is to connect Access to a local MySQL database. This is where I was able to do data migrations of millions of records, is because the data itself is not in Access anymore. It's in your local database with your MySQL database, and you create links basically between that database and Access. So if this is something you're interested in doing, then you would need some kind of WAMP server to be able to do that, and I use XAMPP. And it's available for Windows and for Mac. And with that, you might use the PHP MyAdmin or MyAdmin PHP, but I choose to use Navicat, which I find is more graphically interesting and easier to work with. All right. Before I go on to the first topic of tables, any questions, any comments you'd like to add, something that's not clear, let me know. Gary, do you see any questions yet? No questions yet, eh? Give you guys a second. Anything to add? No, keep going. Thumbs up.
I'll ask a question just to get things going. Tell me if it is possible to use maybe something else. Like how could a company leverage something like GitHub or a service like that? Maybe even I'll just stick with GitHub.
Actually, GitHub is good because especially the code part in Access, the VBA code. What I do myself actually is I host it on GitHub. So as part of attending the webinar, not only we receive a recording of this webinar, you'll also receive a copy of my personal library. So the actual code that I use for VBA when doing data migrations, and because I've made some last-minute tweaks to it. I'm hoping that it's completely bug-free, and I hope to evolve it over time as well. And I'll give you guys access to my GitHub, which has a copy of that source code. So in that regard, Gary, what I would use GitHub for is just making sure that the code that's in Access is also available on GitHub or Bitbucket or something to that effect. All right, no further questions. Let's move on to tables then. Okay, so in Access, you have various data types for your fields. And I here provided a little mapping of what data types you would consider to use when comparing it to the Salesforce data types. So the most common ones that I use are the auto number, which is when you want to create a sequential number. And it's very useful for creating legacy IDs. It's very important that as you're building your tables, that every single row has its unique key. And if one doesn't exist already from your legacy data, Access can create an auto number for you and allow you to use that as your legacy ID. Short text is by far the most used one. Unless I need to do some kind of data calculation, if I have to do some kind of math or a date calculation, everything else goes into a short text. So it could be a date, it could be a number, it could be actual text. The only limitation is just how many characters are available. So if you know that the field may have more than 255 characters, if it's a long text area in Salesforce, or will be a long text area in Salesforce, then you want to use the long text in Access. But other than that, 99% of the time, I'm using short text. For numbers, there is a number field, and you have obviously integers or doubles. I use that for calculations, and only when I need to do calculations. And for currency fields, if you don't need that $sign, because that currency field that you see here does invoke that currency symbol. And then the datetime for dates. I don't usually use time too much, but you can use time fields as well, time components of it. Some considerations when you're creating fields and using fields within Access. So as I mentioned earlier, you always want to have a legacy ID, or at least a unique identifier per table in Access. It just helps identify the record. You'll see later as well, it helps map the legacy ID to a Salesforce ID. And it's generally good practice to have. You also want to have an additional field for the Salesforce ID. So not every single table you're going to work with will be migrated into Salesforce, but the ones that do, you want to create an additional column called ID to hold that resulting Salesforce ID. And then another consideration is you want to avoid any kind of spaces when defining your field names. So whether you put an underscore or just remove spaces altogether, it simplifies your typing in or your referencing to those fields when there are no spaces. Access likes having these square parentheses around fields. If you don't have a space, like if there are no spaces at all, and only use underscores or no spaces, it will automatically know and add those square parentheses for you. But if there is a space, then you have to manually add those square brackets, those square parentheses around the field name. So just something to keep in mind. Diane, I see your question. Can you put currency as a number? You are not restricted in using currency. No, so the idea is that you can use currency if it makes sense to do so, and if you want to do some mathematical calculations on it. The thing about currency, why I mentioned it, but I do avoid it. I prefer using the decimal or the double, is because the currency field will show the display the dollar sign in the field, which when you do an export to CSV file, it will also show that dollar sign, and you don't want to have that when you're importing it into Salesforce. So I kind of put it there, but it's not something I use very often. I would prefer using for currency and for numbers, either the integer or the double number. So here on the right, just to show you how the fields are defined. So you can see I have an ID field, which is short text, a legacy, which is number, company name, so on and so forth. That's how you're defining it. And we'll get to that part where you can either build your own table, or most likely you'll be importing a table from a CSV file. So to import data, basically you go to the menu choice, clicking on external data, new data source, blah, 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 and then basically selecting the CSV file that you want to import. By the way, I don't know if I had mentioned this, but also part of your attending this webinar, you will receive a copy of this entire deck. So you can take notes as you need, but keep in mind that this will be given to you as a PDF at the end. And that's why sometimes I put some comments that are a bit more explicit that I won't really need to talk to, but it's good to have for your reference. So you pick your CSV file. You choose in most cases that you're going to import it as an actual new table in your Access database. Here is where you want to mention what kind of CSV file is it. Is it delimited or is it fixed width? Most of the time it will be delimited, mostly by a comma, which is you're able to specify on the next step. So you specify, and you have the choice of comma, semicolon, tab, and so forth. You have this great feature called text quantifier, which sometimes when you do have spaces or commas or semicolons inside your fields, you can delimitate the entire field with 2 quotation marks or a single quotation mark, and you can specify that right here. And then you can also specify whether the first row has the column fields or not, the names of the fields. As a Canadian, we deal a lot with accents. I imagine too in the US you have Spanish accents. So every time I deal with files, with CSV files, I just go UTF-8 across the board. It's a mindset I just put myself into. You're exporting from Salesforce, importing to Salesforce, everything is UTF-8 across the board. And this way I never have to worry about weird characters being displayed instead of accents. It's a great practice just to get into the habit of doing. And these 2 things are already set by default, the 4-year digits for dates and the date order. We'll get to those details a bit later on as well. The next step in that wizard is basically confirming the data type. So this is where Access will do its best to determine what is the data type for every single field. And it's based on the first, I don't know exactly how many, but the first, let's say, 20 rows of data. So if it sees, for example, just text in those first 20 rows of that particular field, it'll set it to a data type, to a short text. If it just sees dates and it can interpret all of the first 20 as dates, it'll set it as a date. If it just sees numbers, it'll do integers. But you have the ability of then changing it from that default into whatever you want it to be. Here's where if on the last step or second to last step, you have the chance to be able to get access to create its own legacy ID using an auto number. So if your table already has one, then you don't need to use it. But if it doesn't have one, then this is the chance then to create an auto number. And what I do is I rename it because it's by default set to ID. So I rename it to legacy ID to avoid confusion. Again, it's just a process I've gotten used to. I prefer using the field name ID to represent the Salesforce ID and something else like legacy ID or source ID or auto number ID or to represent the one that comes from an auto number or legacy ID. Last one is just to confirm the name of the table that you're going to use when you import it into Access. And it is better not to have a space here, also for the name of the table. And then what's cool is that once that's done, the very last step says, do you want to save these steps? And there are a couple of ways of repeating this import process. One of them is through code, which we'll get through on Thursday. And the other one is more through these clicks. So you're able to, within a couple of clicks here, save that exact process you did so you can repeat it again in the future. And you give it a name for that import. And here's how you would use it again a second time. You would go to external data, to those saved imports, and then click run on the name of the file that you want to re-import. So a great way to repeat things multiple times without going through every single step. Now, there are some times when there are data errors. When the file being loaded, after it is loaded, it might pop up or might create an additional table with the same table name and appended with import errors. And usually this is caused because of a data conversion. If it attempted to put everything to a data, the date type, but was unsuccessful, it'll pop up an error. And it'll tell you what row the error is and what the error is, and what the cause of the error is. And typically it tends to be a data conversion issue. I've seen, for my part, the most of situations is when you think it's a short text, but the length is only going to be 255, but it actually is longer. So it's just a matter of redoing that process and changing the data type for that particular field to the correct data type. And then you can delete this import errors table because it's unnecessary. This is the second way of saving data, and this is what we'll get to a bit more in detail when we look at the code, but the idea is that you can also save the import specification that can be referenced through code. So depending on how you want to import files, whether you want to do it more clicking or more programmatically, you have that choice. I tend more to do the programming stuff because I find it's usually I'm repeating the process multiple times, and I have these little scripts that I run that just basically with one click can import 5, 6, 10 tables at the same time. And if I wanted to do that this way, the other way with the import, saved import, I have to still do one at a time, choose the import file one at a time, or the import saved imports one at a time. Okay, once the table is created, what can you do with it? So first, there are two main views of the table. You have the design view, which is how you add fields, modify fields, and so forth. So you can do some inserting fields, changing the order of the fields and whatnot. And you have your data sheet view, which allows you to do some basic processing. It's not typically the area where I would go to manage or to modify the data, but at least gives you a quick glance of what data you're actually looking at. You can sort columns, you can do some ordering, some basic searches, but you can't save those searches. That's where you would want to use a query. Query is much more powerful, taking that table data, putting it into a query, and then modifying the record or updating the record or analyzing the record and then saving the results. But there are a few things you can do with the data view. Any questions so far? Because we're going to move next to a demo of how to import tables into Access. Any questions so far?
No questions yet.
You guys are quiet. Either you know everything or I'm clear enough that everything is clear, or you're stunned and not quite sure what to say. All clear. Cool. Okay, so let's go to a demo. Pick list values. Okay, that's a great question. So pick list is text, right? It's a short text. If you have a multi-value pick list, you might want to use a long text because that could be longer than 255 characters, but otherwise short text is what I would use. You're welcome. Thanks for the question, Nikita. So here is our Microsoft Access. Hopefully, this isn't the very first time you've seen Access, but if it is, don't worry, I'll walk you through it step by step. So the first thing we want to do is so we notice here on the left is our control panel, our menu choices, or not menu, but our inputs and outputs are different categories of things. This one comes with some pre-built stuff. It's actually my code, the code that you guys are going to receive as well. And these are the modules, the Apex, not the Apex, but the VB8 code that are available to you as part of the webinar. So just to show you what you're going to be getting in the future, you can see how the code is structured. There's comments, functions, and there's a whole bunch of them. We won't cover them all today, but just to show you that these things exist. So there's a utility library. There's examples which show you how to use those utilities in a real example. I/O for any kind of import, output into Access. So how to import files very quickly, export files very quickly with a single click. And then I save the solution one for solutions to the particular project that I'm working on. So I have usually one Microsoft Access database per data migration. And all the custom code that I build for that data migration, I put into solution. And the utilities I leave as is, and I can copy and paste that to the various Access databases, one per migration. So very basic. Obviously, there's nothing really interesting here to look at for the data part. So let's get some external data loaded into Salesforce, into Access. Click on External Data, Data Source, from File, Text File. You browse for a CSV. So I'm going to Webinar, Data. Let's do the account first. This is data that I generated using a tool called Mockaroo. So it's got just a whole bunch of data in it specific to accounts and for contacts. You see the delimited is what we're choosing. We click on Next. We know it is comma-based. We want to make sure you can see here that there is double quotes across multiple fields. So by changing the double quotes as a text qualifier, you can see everything now falls into place properly. And we do want to specify that the first row has our field names. Click on Next. Here's where you can start specifying the data type. So you could go column by column, and you can see the data type changes or could change. I find it's a bit limited because I hate scrolling to the left. So what I do is I go to the advanced page here, where you're able to see in a single glance every single field name and the data type. So you can see, for example, based on the data that it sees, it thinks the postal code is a long integer. And I don't want that. I want it to be short text because I don't plan to do any kind of math on a zip code. Plus, the zip code may contain zip codes and postal codes. So even though it might have only found numbers, there might be later on in the lower rows letters. So by setting it to short text, we know we're good. In terms of indexes, indexes are a little more powerful way of being able to identify which fields need to be indexed for query purposes. It's usually when you have a foreign key to a separate table or a field that might be queried upon very often. We're not dealing with cutting edge or real-time code here. I find in general, I don't worry too much about indexing. I let Access do its thing and don't really care. It's not very often where I have to start really specifying the indexes to get top performance. And like I mentioned before, you want to make sure you're always using UTF-8. Click on Next. Here's where you decide whether you want to have Access automatically add another or auto number. Because we have an ID field here generated for us, we don't need to have another one. So I say no primary key. Click on Next to confirm that the table name. Click on Finish. And then we do want to save these steps to be able to repeat them again in the future. So I say Save, pick the default save name, and we're good to go. we have our table. So opening up, I can either double click, usually double click, opens it up into a tab type format. You can see very quickly the data that I have. I can see here at the bottom how many records there are. So I can see there's 1,000 records. And here's where I can start changing the width of columns just to be able to see some data and take a look at it. But I don't spend a lot of time here on the table side to do analysis because I find it's a bit limited. I'd rather use it in a query. But this at least gives me a quick glance of what I'm looking at, make sure there's no major concerns right away before moving on. Now, one thing you'll notice is that if I just close this, it'll ask me if I want to save the layout. Because I adjusted the columns, Access for some reason decides that it wants to know if you want to save those column widths. So I answer yes, but I tend to just hit Control S to save the table behind the scenes often and avoids that kind of question. All right, we got a couple of questions here. Did I miss the first step of using the first? Yes, so in Vikram, when I was doing the import, I specified that the field name is specified in the first row. It was a checkbox that I did check. Yeah, thanks for answering that question. So the answer to this question here is yes, I want to modify, keep the width, and I want to show you also the design view. So you can see if I double click, it automatically opens to that data sheet view. And I can either click on design to go design view, or you can see on the top left, I can toggle the two views by clicking on this button. So going from design view to data sheet view. And the idea here is what I want to do is I want to rename this legacy ID to legacy ID, and I want to keep it as a short text. Now, you're able to do data conversions very easily. It's very lenient in terms of in Access. You don't have to worry too much about data conversion loss. It's very malleable. It's very easy to go from anything or almost anything to a short text because it'll handle it. And that typically tends to be the one direction I go toward. But if I did choose to change it to a number, it will truncate and remove the data that doesn't fit. So if I did go to state and try to put this as a number, I would basically remove all the states. All the states would be blank. So you definitely want to be careful when you change the data type. But typically, you move it from something to short text, or maybe short text to long text. You don't typically change it to anything else, typically. Sorry, my import generated field 1, 2. Yeah, so the reason you did that is because it didn't. You didn't check the checkbox to say the first row contains. And if for some reason Access is unable to determine what is the field name, if it's either missing the field name in your import file, or it can't read it. If there's an extra column, sometimes depending on where you got the data, you might have some empty blank columns on the right. Access will automatically create these additional fields, and it'll call it field 1, field 2, field 3. So again, I renamed the ID to legacy ID. I changed the data type. I did a Control S because that's my shortcut. So if I come back now to here, you can see it was able to convert the number to a text very easily because it's on the left side now as opposed to the right. And that's it for account. Let's import now. Same process. Let's grab those contacts. So same process, and I can show you here, Vikram. You can see here, first row contains field names. You definitely want to click that. So you make sure that your quotation marks are set and the field name is set. The order doesn't really matter. Go to advanced, make sure the data types look good. Again, here is zip code. You want to make sure it's short text. Here you can see it decided not to do any indexing. We don't really care anyway. Change the code to UTF-8 to prevent any accents from having any issues. Click next, next. In this case, the contact record, as you can see, does not have a legacy ID, so I will let Access create an auto number for me. And then save. And let's save these steps as well. And there you go. And what I'll do here is I'll go right away and I'll change this. Actually, I'm going to change this to a legacy ID. Same syntax as the other. I'm going to change this to a short text. This little key here indicates that it's a key field. It's, again, type of indexing for within Access, not really relevant for us. So we can just untoggle it here by clicking on primary key. You could set whatever ID you want to a primary key. It doesn't really matter in the context of loading data into Salesforce. It does work more, or it's more important when you're building an application entirely within Access. But the other thing I forgot to do was add our Salesforce ID field. So when I right-click on the gray part here, I'm able to add fields. You can see here I'm going to insert a row, and here's what I'm going to use to store my Salesforce ID. Control-Shift-Save for that, and I'm going to go back to the account and do the same thing there too. There we go. So account is there. Here's our contact records. You can see the basic information for our contact. And here we have a company. So we will be able to see, this is how we're going to do our join from the company name to the company. Cool. All right, so that takes care of importing tables. Any further questions on that before we move on? Because next topic is going to be queries. Gary, any questions?
Sorry, nope, no questions yet.
All right. Let's talk about queries. So there are, what field types should be used for checkboxes? Great question. Again, I use short text. And I specify, usually you have a few choices for text boxes, and actually we'll get to that in a more explicit detail. But to answer your question offhand, I do use a short text, and you set it either to 1 for true or 0 for false, or you can set it to the string called true with the word true or the word false. Either one of those works. Okay, so for queries have, you're very welcome. Thank you for the question, Derek. For queries, you have got 3 views. So if you remember, tables have 2 views, that design view and the data sheet view. Queries have 3 views, the design view, the data sheet view, and an SQL view. And that allows you to be able to modify the SQL statement directly, which is really cool and useful if you want to copy and paste the SQL statement and change a data name, change the table name, for example, or do any kind of corrections because something happened and you mixed things up a little too much and you corrupted your query. You can always go into the SQL view and be able to modify your SQL statement that's generated for you automatically through dragging and dropping certain fields and typing certain values. This is actually how I learned how to write SQL statements. Is I would come to Access, I would type in or drag my fields that I want to specify all my search criteria, my where criteria, and then I click on the SQL view to see that resulting query, which is really cool, especially when you have left joins and right joins, inner joins, outer joins. It was a way I taught myself how to use SQL. So in design view, you can do a whole bunch of cool stuff. You can obviously add tables, multiple tables to your query, depending on what you want to show. You can choose which fields from that table you want to show. So let's say, for example, I want to design a query that will look at just the city names. I want to just analyze to make sure I've got this data from this legacy source. I'm not sure about how corrupt the data is or how clean the data is. One of the first things I might want to do is look for fields that I want to analyze, one of which would say is cities. So I would pull in the account table, for example, pull in the city field, and then figure out what I have. What are all my permutations of the city, and to see if I need to do any kind of corrections on it. So that's a great way to do that, to specify the fields that we want to look at as opposed to all the fields. It's also very useful if you have a table with dozens and dozens of fields and you want to focus your attention or your analysis on a few select fields at one particular time. You can do, of course, joins. As you saw in that massive table, you can see all kinds of joins from parent-child relationships to all kinds of various lookups, dozens and dozens. I don't think I've ever hit a limit of how many joins you can do. You can do some basic transformations. So there's some operators we'll get to in a moment about how to manipulate the data, to transform the data, and so forth, which are great. And you can use totals, which is a fantastic feature to be able to start doing counts and wheres and groups and the first instance of or the last instance of. Very, very powerful stuff. You can relabel fields. So part of the process of preparing data to be loaded into Salesforce is making sure that the output fields, the labels of the fields, match exactly what they match or need to be in Salesforce. So the input file might have all kinds of different wording, right? The account name might be called company name, but you're able to relabel the field in a query very easily to say, all right, take that company name field and call it or relabel it name. So when you import it into Salesforce, you can use that auto match field locator so that you don't have to worry about creating a map when loading data into Salesforce. And you can add additional fields, ones that don't appear in a table at all. You can either add them as a static value or as a calculated value. So let's say, for example, you have a field called active in your account, and you want all the accounts that you're loading into Salesforce to have that active set to true. Well, I can create a static field called active and set the value to true, and it'll appear as true for all the records being used. So really cool stuff. And as I mentioned before, anytime you want to reference any of the fields from a table in a query, you have to use those square parentheses. So if you don't have any spaces, you don't need to worry about adding those parentheses. But if you have spaces, you do have to worry about it. So just something to keep in mind and to repeat to yourself. And you can see I even gave some examples. So in the first example, because there's a space between legacy and contact, Salesforce and Access will not know what to do with it, and it'll cause an error. You'll have an error pop up saying, I don't know what to do with this thing. In the second case, though, you'll see I did put the square parentheses around legacy contact, but full name doesn't need it because there are no spaces. So Access will automatically put in those square parentheses silently without any kind of error, which is great. And same thing for the third one. If I don't put any square parentheses at all because I don't need them, Access will add them for me and silently, and I don't need to worry about them. So further in the design view, we have the ability to do certain string manipulations. As I mentioned, string, by being the most popular, that short text, you want to do or might want to do a whole bunch of manipulations to those those text values. And there is a whole library in Access that you can use, but these are the ones that I find I use most often. So left allows you to parse the first X number of characters from a string. In this case, for example, the first 3. Mid allows you to pull off also a certain number, but starting at a certain character point, at a certain position within that string. It starts at 1, so the index begins at 1 for the first character as opposed to 0, which for some systems use. The right pulls the right side or parses the right side string for 5, let's say. Formatting allows you to do some basic formatting. I use it sometimes when I want to truncate or round integers, if I have, or doubles, decimals. If I have a long or too many, sometimes decimals, I want to only show 2 of them. You can specify through a format how many decimals to show. In-string will find the position of something. It's like that find expression in Excel. So you can find the position of something. It's missing a comma now that I look at this. Replace will replace one string with another string. So very good if you have double spaces, for example, you can run that to remove those. And then trim removes all white spaces, both from the left side and the right side. And there is a left trim or L trim and an R trim, but I use trim and I don't need to worry about whether it's on the left or the right. Basic operators and, or, not, equal to, and not equal to. So it doesn't use the other version of not equal to, which is the exclamation point and the equal sign. It prefers the greater than, less than sign. Other operators, you can use wildcards. So like is your basic open-ended search, whether you want to search on the right or the left. Normally, I would draw your attention to performance issues, but we're not dealing with all kinds of lots and lots of data. So putting that wildcard before is not a big issue. You have an if statement, which for some reason Microsoft Access likes having the double I instead of just an if. But you have an if statement, true or false, and you have is empty and is null. So an example where we put all of this together, let's say we had a field called full name, which contains both the first name and the last name. Let's forget about middle names for this example. what this example basically does is that it looks at the full name, determines if there is a space in the full name. And if it's true, we take the left part of it up until that space, minus 1 character for the space itself, versus if we don't have a space, we take the full name. So this would be a good way, for example, to find what is your first name from a full name. And I can do that all within a query as well. Second view I mentioned is the SQL view, which is really cool to be able to either make slight modifications to the SQL statement or copy and paste it or replace certain things, data correction as needed. And the data sheet view has the same kind of operators as we saw with the table, but this is where I would actually do them. So anytime I need to do this analysis on tables, I do it in a query. And because the key part is once you've done that, you can actually save them as a filter. So you don't need to keep on repeating those same filters. So this is what the design view looks like. You're basically pulling in various tables from your left side menu, and then you're choosing which fields you want to show in your query. And here's where you can start doing operators. So in this case, I had taken full name as is. So you can see it takes the field name from the table. And in the second one, you can see I've actually relabeled the calculation to be first name. And that's where we had that example from before, where we're taking the full name, doing our formula to be able to pull off the first name. And you can see the result when I move to the data sheet view. You can see the full name and then the full name, the full name and then the first name. And then if I were to look at the SQL view, you would basically see the same thing in an SQL statement. So just in case you wanted to do that. I don't go to SQL statement very often, but it's good to know it's there if I ever need it. And if you want to teach yourself how to use or how to build SQL statements. All right, in terms of filtering, so there's 2 basic filters, the and the or. And the way that Access does this is based on what row you're in. So if you want to do an and filter across the fields that you've specified in your query, you make sure that they're all on the same row. So you can see here on the left side, the and filter, I'm looking at all the records for which the city is Miami and state is Florida. And that gives me my results here below. But if I wanted to do an or, I would change the line where I put Florida underneath or Miami underneath. It doesn't really matter which order it's in, as long as it's on different rows. And this is where it's city is Miami or state is Florida. And you can do this for as many fields as you want. And any combination, you can have a whole bunch of ands and a whole bunch of ors as needed. Joins. So joins are really cool. It replaces the VLOOKUPs. So you pull 2 tables across. You basically pick the field that you want to connect to from one table and drag the connection to another table, to another field in the other table. The order of which table to which table doesn't matter too much. It ends up being more or less the same anyway, but I tend to get into the practice of always going from the parent to the child. And the reason for that is that by always following that same principle, when I decide what kind of join type it is, the order is always the same. So what I mean by that is if I just, as we see here on the left, I just want to have, or I just connect these 2 fields together, it considers it to be a union, which means it'll only show records for which the company name on the account matches the contact name on the right. And if there's no match, the records will not be displayed. But if I want to see all the contacts or all the accounts, let's say, whether or not it has a matching contact record and the contact record, whether or not it matches, then I would choose, I would double click on this line here and I would pick option 2, which basically says exactly like as I did. It's a left join, and it explains it more in basic English, where it says it will show you all the accounts and all the contacts, whether or not it actually matches or not. And when there isn't a match, you'll just see a blank value in the contact side. And if you want to do the opposite, you want to see all the contacts, which may or may not have an account, you would pick option 3. If I had, and this order intersection, that's exactly right. Thank you, Rohit. It's an intersection. So the order, what I mentioned earlier, if I go from the parent table to the child table, this would be the order. If I went from the child to the parent, options 2 and 3 would be reversed. So it ends up being the same thing, but you have to remember and read which one is which I don't like doing. I prefer having a process and sticking to it, which is why I always go from the parent to the child. And then I know what 2 means, what 3 means, without me having to reread it every single time, or remember, wait a minute, did I move from the parent to the child, or did I move from the child to the parent? I hope that's clear. Let me know if that's not clear. I can show you more through examples. Maybe that'll be clear if you're not quite sure what I'm talking about. And I actually go further in examples here where I show exactly that. So here I have a left join where I have the account and the contact, and I put an additional criteria here, is null. So basically what this example is showing is show me all the accounts for which I don't have a matching contact. I'm missing a contact for that account. That's what the is null does. If I removed is null, I would just see all the accounts and all the matching contacts if there are any. But that is null is very powerful to show me the ones that are missing that matching record. And the same thing in reverse for the next one. If I have the arrow going the other way, I can do the same kind of concept where I can ask for or want to see all the contacts that don't have a matching account. So great way to analyze data. Another thing I use very often is counting. So I want to know, as I mentioned before, if I have a table, I don't know exactly what I'm getting. I want to see how many cities I have, and what is the most popular city. I can drag in, or let's say state in this example. I can grab state twice from the legacy account, and I can create a total where I say the first column is group all the states together, and the second one counts how many there are, and in a descending order. So I can see on the data that I've been provided that Texas is the most popular state, and so forth. And this also allows me to see the variations and see, if I have Texas spelled multiple different ways, I'll know which is the most popular way, and then modify the data to fit the most popular way, for example. So counts, great way to analyze data. And the duplicate wizard, which is also one of my favorites, because not only does it find duplicates in one particular field in a table, it can find it across multiple fields. So let me show you through how that works. You basically choose the table you want to work with, and you can also choose a query as well. It's not limited to just tables. So let's say, for example, we want to choose the legacy account. And here's where you choose which tables may contain duplicate values. So you can choose one or multiple fields. Here, if I choose just company name, it'll find all the duplicate companies. But if I want to find duplicate companies for a particular city, then I can just click on the city, click on this little chevron here, and now I'll only find duplicates for which the city and the company name match or are duplicated. So also a great way of finding data. And the last step of this wizard is to show or to ask which other fields you want to have displayed in the resulting query. So, show me all the company names or all the records from account that have a matching or duplicate company name, and show me all the records, all the fields related to those records. Some naming considerations, because now we have got tables, we've got queries, and it's important for Access that the name is unique. You can't have the same table named or the same query named after the same table. So what I tend to do is have, again, best practice, always avoiding spaces like I mentioned earlier. I choose names for the tables that make sense and are not Salesforce tables. So if it came from a legacy system or another system, I would either put the system name in there or legacy or source or some other word in front of the object that I'm using. And I would save the word account or contact or opportunity for data that I've exported from my Salesforce. It just helps determine which one or identify which one is which. And for queries, what I tend to do is one of two things. Actually, let's next slide. Okay, some examples in legacy, like I said, account, contact. Very common for me to export data related to users or record types to avoid remembering that record type ID if I want to look up for certain various versions of, let's say, opportunity record types. Having that record type object exported from Salesforce helps quite a bit. I got excited. The query side of things. So again, you want to avoid spaces. And here's where you do want to use the same name for the Salesforce ID, but you want to prefix it with something. So what I tend to do is, because there is a certain sequence that you have to load data into Salesforce, for example, you load first accounts and then contacts, what I would do is I would call the resulting query that I'm building for being imported into Salesforce, I would call that 01 account. And this way I know it's the first record or the first table that I'm going to export and import into Salesforce, versus contact would be 02 contact. I know that I need to import contacts or into Salesforce second. And I would keep going in this kind of sequential order. So it serves as a type of menu to know for myself as I'm building these things, what is the sequence that I'm going to be doing to import the data into Salesforce. And of course, it's especially important when you need to know, in the case of contacts, for example, what is the account ID to match it to. There are certain queries that I build that are not meant or will not be imported into Salesforce. And these are the kinds of queries that kind of manipulate the data within Access itself. So I've developed a naming convention that I use for all my accesses. I start the query with the name QRY for query, and then I have the type. So what is this query trying to do? Is it looking for, is it a check or a verification or a validation of some kind? For example, checking boundaries or for different weird city names or valid email addresses, I would use the word check or CHK. If it's updating data within another table within Access, I would call it an update versus the delete or a duplicate. In that example we saw before, I would rename it to be QRY duplicate, and then what I'm actually checking to be a duplicate. And here are some examples as well. Any questions before we move on to a demo? Gary, how are you holding up?
I am doing well. I haven't seen any questions yet.
Yeah, it's a bit quiet. No worries, as long as you guys are understanding. The most important part is that you guys are following, you understand what I'm saying. That is the key here. So if it's clear for you, it's good for me. Yeah. And this is the fun demo part, because I can, and part of the challenge was figuring out what to talk about, because I could talk a lot about queries. So we'll see how far we get. All right, so close up those tables. Let's start looking at some analysis. So again, we don't quite know what we got for data. So let's take a look at things. And if you guys want to throw in a particular example, if you want to see me look at data here, you want me to do a particular quick test, let me know. I'll be happy to do it. So the first thing we want to do here is create. And we want to go to our query design. Now we'll talk about a few of these later. The most basic ones we're actually going to be using are these two for today. So query design sets me up to be able to create that query. And here's where I have a few options, a few ways to get data in here. My most typical one is just dragging and dropping. So I would take, let's say I start with account first, just drag and drop the account into the query. Able to resize this a little bit so I can see what's going on. But you also can see here on the right, I can just double click on these things to import multiple versions of the same table. And you can see I can refer to each one uniquely because it has an _1, _2, and so forth. And this is great if you have to refer to the same table multiple times, which a typical use case would be converting a user, like an owner ID field or a created by, and you need to refer to the user record in Salesforce. That would be one way or one reason why you would want multiple instances of the same table. But there are other examples as well. Let's just focus right now on this. So you see there's a list of all the fields we have in the table, plus this little star here. The star I don't use very often. It basically means everything. So if I were to drag and drop just the star here, and then switch to my data sheet view, you'll see it just basically shows me everything that's in the table. But it's not really that interesting. And you don't have any control because it's basically just saying, give me everything. What I typically do is just drag and drop the fields that I want to work with one by one, or I can shift click. No, shift click, there you go. Or shift click all of them like this too, and drag all of those down. Simple enough. Let's just focus, though, just for now, on something very simple. We'll start with city. So I go to my data sheet view, and I can see here are all my cities. There's no particular order. We still have our 1,000 records. And this is where I would start doing some basic analysis. Like if this was a real situation, the first thing I would start doing is ascending, taking a look at everything to see there's no white space at the front or spaces in the front or weird characters like numbers that shouldn't be there. Same thing for descending. Make sure that the upper and lower bounds are looking good. Maybe a quick glance to see what things look like. But then by far and wide, the most typical scenario would be to add that second city. And then if I right click, I have this option to add totals to the list of choices here. And here's where I can specify a whole bunch of different operations that I want to do for those totals. I can do group, sum, count, blah, 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 expression. So I won't go through every single one right now. There's too many to go through, but the most common one is the group by and the count. So this is basically saying, show me all the cities that I have, group them by city name, and show me how many are in each group. And it shows me alphabetically each one. So this way I can see what is the most common city, for example. I can see what is the least common. And it gives me, as you can see, instead of 1,000 records to go through, I now have only 298, which is very easy to go through as a glance to see what am I looking at? How crappy is this data, or how clean is this data? Similarly, I can add more fields. So let's remove this for a second. I'll just remove the totals by right-clicking again, clicking on totals. Let's add state. We'll remove city. All I'm doing, by the way, is clicking on the top here. You can see my arrow kind of changes. My mouse changes from the cursor inset to a little down arrow. I click on it, and I'm clicking on the delete button to remove these things. Let's take a look at city and state. So you can see here the various differences. And again, if I want to do the same kind of count, I can do that. I don't necessarily need to use the same fields. I can actually just throw in the ID field, do my totals, do my groups, and count. And I can see all the combinations of city and state as well. Nope, not ID, because ID is always blank, so that doesn't really help. Let's choose the legacy ID. Don't forget that ID is saved for the later Salesforce ID. So you can see again the count. So I didn't have to necessarily choose the same field to do the counting, as long as I have a unique field, and it's all that matters, or a field that has a value, I should say. But this is where we're able to do, let's just get rid of this for now. And here's where I'm able to do all kinds of analysis. So when it comes to time for strings, when I right-click on any of these values, I have a list of choices. And it's quite intelligent. It knows what I'm looking at and what operations are available to me. Actually, to prove that, actually, they're all strings now. OK, let's stick with that. So the idea here is when I right-click, it tells me, show me all the records that equal Miami or don't equal Miami, contain Miami or don't contain Miami. So very easy way for me to figure out how many Miamis are there and what is the equivalent state. I can untoggle the filter just by clicking here to return back to where I was before. Same thing here, equals Florida. So I can see all the cities that are in Florida. So really easy way just to figure out what I have. I can say, show me everything that doesn't equal Miami. So it removes it. And you can see here at the bottom how many have been removed. You can see 9 records were removed. So another way of analyzing data. And I can keep on doing this. I can say, don't equal this, does not equal this, does not equal this, across any of these fields. So another way of segregating your data down to what you really care about. I'm going to throw in a couple extra fields here just for the sake of giggles and to be able to show you a little more cool stuff. So let's do that. I already have state. Let's keep going with strings for a second, though. What's really cool, too, is not only is it contains, does not contain, equals, not equal to, but if I want to find, for example, all the fields that end with ng, if I just highlight the ng and right-click again, I have different choices. I have contains, does not contain, like before, but I have ends with and does not end with. So I can quickly find all the ones that end with a particular string, whether it's 1 character, 2 characters, or so forth. And again, I can combine. I can, let's stick with strings for a second. I can also say, for example, find me all the strings at if I'm at the beginning of a string and I right click, it changes the search criteria. Begins with, does not begin with, contains, not be contained. So I can be very, very specific on the exact string that I want to find with all these different permutations of filtering. When it comes to blank fields, I also have the choice. It knows it's blank, so I can say, show me all the ones that are blank or not blank. So actually, it's more interesting to go this way. So I can see here are all the records that's missing a website. And you, again, always have that count to know how many there are. So basically now at this point, I can do all kinds of searching, filtering, whatnot, does not equal to, equals Littleton, does not equal to Littleton. I can decide whatever criteria that I want, and now I want to save this. So I can go here to advanced filter and sort, and basically click a couple times here and save as query. And this is where I would save that. I don't always do this method because sometimes I'm just playing with data. I don't really care about what I'm doing. But the idea here is it shows me the end result of all the operations that I did in a nice little query. And you can see it's a separate query from the one I built. So it has a kind of a copy of it. But you can also come back to this view and do the same thing I did before. Here, I can say, for example, where website is not equal to blank, where city is like, everything begins with the letter A, for example. That's another way to do this as well. So either I can type it or I can use clicking to get it. In the case where I want to add a field, so we talked about, for example, let's pretend that the account object in Salesforce has an active column. We want to make sure it's always set to true. What I'm able to do here is enter a label for that field and specify true. The question of, for checkboxes, what do I use? I can use the word true like this, or I can use the value 1 and 0 and false for the alternative. So when I click on this, you'll see that the value is 1 for everything. So really cool to do that way, but I'm not limited to static values. I'm actually able to do certain formulas here. So I can say if if, say, state is equal to Florida, then it's true, else false. Open that up for you. So if state is Florida, set active to true, else set it to false. And you can see here it's false for everything. Is it everything? Is there any state that's Florida? Oh, maybe because I put too many criteria here. Yeah, let's remove some of these search criteria. You can see the ones that are Florida have true, and the ones that are not Florida are false. And we can verify that by clicking on equals 1 to see, yeah, it's all Florida. And the opposite too. Doesn't equal 0, and they're all not equal to Florida. So that's another way to add some stuff. Let's talk about, yeah.
Alex, sorry, I want to ask a question. Can you maybe explain just a quick use case of where you've used something like this in the past, doing a data import?
For the active type style?
Yeah, putting a formula in active. How have you used that?
Well, like I mentioned, the active was the first one that I thought of. But let's say, for example, there is a field that doesn't exist in the data you've received, but you want to have it in Salesforce. Another example would be, well, let me start a new query to show you an example. If I go to legacy contact, in the contact, I only have full name. And as we know in Salesforce, we have a first name and last name. So we wanted to separate the full name into first name and last name. And these columns don't exist. So one way to create them would be to create that formula field that parses the first name and last name from full name. So the first thing I would do in this example would be to take the full name, look at the data, see what I got. See, okay, I've got 1,000 records. One thing, for example, I could see is, do I have any spaces? So I'm highlighting the space between them and saying, for example, show me all the records that don't contain a space. You can see the answer is none. So I know for sure there's always at least one space in the name. So that's good to know. Now I can do my filter. And I'm going to cheat a little bit because I'm going to take that formula field that I created. And go back to here because I don't want to make a mistake. Where'd it go? This guy. So here you can see I've taken the full name and I've parsed the first name. And you can see it's trimmed. It has no white space on it whatsoever. So I don't need any more of the full name. And I can specify, we know in Salesforce it's not actually spelled like that. It's spelled first name like this. I can now have that first name in the contact record. So this is a field that didn't exist that I created based on a formula. Does that answer your question, Gary?
Yep, it did. Thank you.
Cool. And of course, I can do the same thing for last name. I have to just build the formula to do the same thing for last name to get the right side based on the space. But I'll leave that exercise up to you. So that's a very common use. And you can already see that I'm starting to name these fields, or at least the ones that I'm creating manually, to match the ones that are in Salesforce. So here, for example, what I should have done is create the active field with the __C to prepare it for being loaded into Salesforce. Let's take a look at duplicates. I'm going to save these just for our temporary data. And I'm going to call them query 1, query 2. Very bad idea. Oh, actually, I'm not going to do that. Let's do this properly. Query check count. Follow my own best practices. I'm pressing F2 to rename query check contact. Okay. Duplicates. So here's where I jump in and use the wizard. I find it's much more useful. You could build the query yourself, but why do it when Access can do it for you? This is where I go to the query wizard. This is more of a baby step type of format. The wizard allows you to create a simple query yourself, which we don't need to do because we know how to do it. We should know how to do it using a design query. So really, the only two options I find useful are the duplicates and unmatched. And we're going to talk about the duplicates. Let's say, for example, we know, well, we don't know how many duplicate accounts there are. We could have duplicate accounts. Let's see how many are there. So we'll choose the legacy account. Move on to next. The company name is where we think the duplicates are. And for the results, we want to basically show all the fields. We want to know all the remaining fields for that particular table. We're going to save the results in query duplicate account name. Then here are our results. So you can see, first of all, 55 duplicates. That means there are 55 records. There may be, it just means more than one, right? It could be 2 instances, 3 instances, 4 instances, and so forth. But you can see here, okay, I got 2 companies with the same name, and here is all the remaining information. And this is where you can do your determination of how you want to how you want to use this data to figure out what your next steps are. Whether you want to merge these records, inform the customer that they have to clean up their data before you want to import it into Salesforce, or whatever else the action you want to take. But obviously, you don't want to duplicate information, or at least if there, in this case, there is a company name and you want to allow it, you want to have then maybe a more restrictive search criteria. This only searches for duplicates of the same company name. But let's do the same thing over a second time and say we want to find for all the ones that are in the same, have the same city name and same state. And obviously there should be far fewer. duplicate. Account name. You can see now there's only one duplicate that have the same company name and same state. Let's talk a bit about joins. So what we're going to start doing is start building our queries for getting ready for building or migrating into Access, or loading into Access, I should say. So let's take a look and start building the relationship between the account and the contact. So I would go to create, again, design query, pull in my legacy contact, my legacy account, open these guys up a little bit just to be able to see more data. And then we know we're going to match on the company name. So again, best practice, starting with the parent, I click and drag and I match it to company on the contact. And here's where that is the intersection between the two of them. If I double click on this, you'll see that's where my pop-up appears, and I'm able to specify the relationship type. For now, we're going to just look for ones that match completely, that have records on both tables. And then I'm able to pull data. So let's say, for example, in this case, we want to prepare or get ready for the contacts. Or let's just see how many there are actually before we get even further. I can pull fields from both tables, show my results, and now I can see all the contacts and their equivalent or their matching accounts. So in this case, it's not very interesting because we're looking at a company name and company name, but you could say, for example, show full name, get rid of this guy. So you can see the full name of people. Oh, by the way, I should say, you can always, instead of just dragging and opening this thing up, I can double click to adjust the width automatically to be able to fit all the data in that particular column. So here you can see just basically a type of analysis of seeing all the company names and all the contact names. So you can see I only have 64 matching records, which isn't so much. But again, this is just dummy data that I pulled from the internet, so I'm not too surprised about it. So let's take this one step further and figure out now matching records. Let's find out all the contacts all the accounts rather, that don't have a contact. And the way that I would do that is I would double click on this, specify I want to see all the contacts, all the accounts. You can see the arrow changes. It's now considered to be a left join. And I want to say, so show me all, if I just do this, let me show you the results. You'll see all the accounts. We're back to more, in this case, more than 1,000 records because there are duplicates in the company. So it found duplicates of the matching contacts. But the idea is that this shows us all the companies and whether or not they do have a matching contact or not. What's more interesting than that is knowing which ones are blank, or which ones are matching, I should say. Let me go back. And you can see here we got our 64. So this is where we can see which ones have a matching contact. And the way I can do that is by specifying here, for example, on the contact is null. So this is basically saying, show me all the contacts that don't have a matching contact. And you can see 940. Or I do the opposite. Show me all the contacts for which there may not be a matching account. And I'm going now to an account table saying is null. And here are all the contacts that don't have an account or a matching account. Okay, let's talk as it's missing and then output queries. Okay, so the next step would be then, once we finish our analysis, now of course you have to actually change the data, right? So many ways to do that. You saw me transforming data. I'm able to do certain operations on certain strings here as well. But sometimes you just need to manually correct the data or the source of the data. You might have to get the client to tell them, look, your data is crap. Here's everything you need to fix, and build all those check queries to be able to analyze the data. And that's typically what I tend to do is because the client is responsible for their own data, garbage in, garbage out, A lot of the times what I do is I analyze all the data and I tell them, here are all the problems with the data. Please fix it at the source. If they want me to do it, of course, I can do it, but sometimes you need guidance because you might not know exactly how their data works or what they need to do. There are certain things, of course, you can do for correcting data. Let's say for city names, let's say they use different versions of city names and you want to be able to correct that. There are queries that you can build to do that, or you can do it in code. This is where I normally jump straight to code just because I'm more familiar with it, but I can show you a couple of ways of how to manipulate or change the data in Access using queries. Let's do that. So let's pretend, I'll close this one up. I'll start a brand new one. Create my design query. Let's say, for example, we want to change, let's say we want to change how many Miamis we have. We have 9. So let's say we want to change all the Miamis to Miami 2. It doesn't make much sense in this context, but let's say Miami is not written correctly and we want to change it to Miami and the number 2. So what we would do is we first do the same thing we've done before. We create our query. We pull in the data we want to see, and then we can change the query type from here. So we move from a select query, which is what we used, and we go to a update query. And basically we say, we now are able to say what we want to update the field to. So in our case, we actually want to look for the word Miami. That's our criteria. And we want to update this field to Miami 2. And again, I mean, this is just the beginning of what you can do with it, because you can have all kinds of criteria, but you only want to modify maybe certain parts or certain fields. So you might have 4 or 5 different fields that specify the criteria, but you only, out of the result of that, you might only want to modify one field, or in reverse. I'm keeping it simple for this webinar, not to go too complicated, but the idea here is I'm able to run this, and it warns me, you're going to modify 9 records. And if I click on yes, then when I go back to open up that legacy, you'll see all the data has been modified from Miami to Miami 2. So that's one way within queries to be able to modify records. Again, no code, only clicks. And it can be quite powerful, but it's limited to a certain extent depending how dirty or how clean the data is. What I tend to do in these situations is more build a mapping file where I know I need to map certain fields from one value to another. And I create within code a mapping function to do that. We'll get to that on Thursday's session. Because it leads to another topic that I kind of glossed over, but typically for data migrations, I tend to do them twice. Once is for UAT and once is for production for go live. So what's great about Access, one of the benefits I find of it is that I'm able to build all of these check queries, all of these manipulations, all of these tools, build up my library of things that I need to do, export the queries from Access, import it into Salesforce for UAT, allow the client to do their UAT period, and then when the time comes to go to production, which could be a few weeks later, I basically just get a refresh of the data, the source data, throw it back into Access, run the same queries, make sure everything works properly, and shoot it off. And all the structure is already in place. So build it once, use it multiple times. And sometimes, depending on the project, I might take certain portions of code or functionality or queries from one project and copy it, paste it into another. Cool. So let's start building then our output query for contacts and accounts. Again, any questions? If there's a particular topic you want me to dive a bit further in, I'm happy to do it. Just let me know. So let's build our contact one first, because that is the order of things. So create, we're going to throw in account. And basically, we're going to, one by one, throw them into here and label them as necessary. Relabel them as necessary. So account ID, we're going to leave blank because that's going to come from Salesforce. And actually, I don't necessarily even need to throw it into the query. So I can either decide to not show it or just hide it altogether. Legacy ID, I'll leave as is. And here's where I would start changing the name. So I know just by familiarity that the account name is called name. So I can just relabel it as such. Website doesn't exist, so it's going to be a custom field, street, and so forth. So I'm going to do a little cheat here where I'm going to, instead of doing this manually one by one, I'm going to copy and paste it from another database, another Access database. I would basically continue this exercise to build this. Again, what's really cool is I'm able to copy and paste tables, queries, and code from any Access database into any other Access database. So that's exactly what I just did now. And you can see here, I have legacy ID, the name, the building street where I'm concatenating street 1 and street 2 with a space between them. You can see I'm using the and sign for concatenation, building city, state, postal code, and country. And the results look like this. So I can save that. That one is good to go. And I'll do the same thing for a contact. Difference for contact is I am using that join. So I have that join from company to company name. And I've actually, from the legacy account, I've pulled in the Salesforce ID. It's right here. So you can see all the other tables, all the other fields are pulling from the table legacy contact. But this field is actually pulling the ID from the legacy account. And it's going to be used to store that account ID. If I look at it now, you'll see it's blank, right? It has not been populated yet because I haven't uploaded the data into Salesforce, but it's ready to go. And you can see full name is here, but I don't really care. Like I don't actually need it to be loaded into Salesforce. That field doesn't exist. So all we really care about right now, first name, last name, and that active field. That's how it basically build out 01, 02, 03, and keep on going. If, for example, I needed to first load in users, I would maybe call that one 01 users, and then account I would call 02 account, 03 contact, and so forth. As long as that order is followed, it doesn't matter what the numbers are. You can change it as you go, but the idea is that this way you know what order and sequence to import into Salesforce. That's it for the query demo. Any further questions? Anything you want me to show you specifically to queries? Do you feel you got a handle on things? We can always also, if there's questions that you come up again between sessions or after the session, I'm happy to, at the start of next session, to go through some of these questions to go a bit deeper. So don't feel you have to jump in right now, but now isn't the chance for you to do that. Yeah, sure, I can do that. Thank you, Diana. There are a whole bunch of fields on the contact. For this example, I'm just taking a few, but I could throw in additional ones. The idea here is I've connected the contact company to the legacy account company name. And I say I only want the contacts that do have a company on the contact, on the account. I don't want to import contacts that don't already have or don't have a matching account. And the way that I say, I basically have set up the query in preparation for when I will have the ID from Salesforce for that account. So you'll see I don't, when I export from Access and import into Salesforce, I'll first do the account table or the account query all together. I'll get the results from that result CSV file when you import through Data Loader. And then I'll take the results, put it back into Access, and update the ID on the account object, which will then populate the account ID in this query. And I'll show you how that works in case it's not clear, because that's a lot of words I just said. Okay, got it. Awesome. Again, I'll step you through that process. Duplicate check sensitive. So it is not case sensitive. And that's one reason why, and leads to a good question, whenever you export IDs from Salesforce, you do want to use that 18-digit character, not the 15. So if any reason you have 15, it's just like Excel. It doesn't recognize the differences between cases. So yeah, it's not case sensitive. Thank you, Vikram, for that question. Okay, let's go back. to importing and exporting into Salesforce. I'll be happy to come back if you guys think of a question, don't worry. So let's talk about the overall process. I kind of alluded to it before, but here it is more visually. I'm much more visual than auditory, so I'd rather have things written down. It's clearer for me, and I'm sure it's for you as well. The idea here is you have our legacy database from which you are able to get, hopefully, that CSV file from their system, and you load that CSV file into Salesforce, into Access. And you specifically load it into a table within Access. And then you do some kind of transformations or analysis, and the end result is building these queries that are going to be used to export from Access and then import into Salesforce. So the queries you then export and then use a data loader, for example, or Jitterbit to load into Salesforce. And you really want to stay with CSV files as much as you can. You want to avoid Excel, of course. You can use any text-based field or file, but CSV works quite well. We've already kind of covered it. We want to make sure that when you are building your query that you're using the exact Salesforce name. It helps with that matching and mapping when loading into Salesforce. You want to confirm also that the data looks good. So give it a quick glance before you actually export it. We got our thumbs up from Mr. Schwarzenegger. And then we go through the steps of exporting. So we go to export to CSV file. We specify the file name. We go through a similar exercise as we did for the importing, but for exporting, where we specify it's comma-based, it's text qualifiers, double quotes. It's including the first name, or include the first name on the, including the name on the first row. Again, UTF-8, always want to remember doing that. And you can save the export specification just like you could with the import specification. This is when you want to use or will use code at a later on stage versus the save functionality from here if you want to use just clicks. So you save and finish, and this is where you're able to save those exact steps to repeat the process very quickly a second time without code. And here's how you access that again to be able to repeat that process, that export process, from going to the external data, saved exports, and then running the export. So when loading into Salesforce, I prefer data loader like I mentioned earlier, and the reason is you can specify that you're to use UTF-8 across the board. You can control the batch size. Sometimes I find that because there might be triggers or workflows that are based on record creation, you want to be able to give the system enough time to be able to do that. So being able to change the batch size really helps to reduce throttling. I love the fact that we can use bulk API. So, do those tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of records. It's great. You can see when the data process or the migration, the import is finished, you have the error files and the success files that you can use to map your IDs back. And it's free. I love free. Jitterbit I do use from time to time if I know I need to do the same process, the same import, export many, many times. And I have done that before, because then you can set up your entire process and then use clicks. So you don't have to go through the tedious steps of using data loader and specifying your mapping and so forth. You set it once in Jitterbit, and then you're good to go. But the minute you modify any of these fields, if you want to add an extra column, an extra field, you have to redo the whole process in Jitterbit versus Salesforce in the data loader. It's much easier to be adaptable. So it depends what your tool of preference is. So this slide is not necessarily specific to Access, but I thought I would throw that in there for your own benefit, because the question does come up from time to time about notes and files, because with Lightning, it's not so easy anymore with enhanced notes and files. So I cheat a little bit. I do a two-step process where I import them into the legacy note and attachments, and then use the Magic Mover app from AppExchange to convert them from legacy to the Lightning version. So I won't go through all this slide, but the idea is that this tells you line by line exactly what you need to do to be able to import files and notes into Lightning. And because there's lots of files that you need to deal with, just again, best practice, you might have your own, but the idea is I like having separate structure, folder structure for the different files. So one folder just for my data that comes from either a legacy system or from Salesforce that I've exported myself. One folder for all the files that I intend to upload into Salesforce, and another folder to show the results, the success and the failure CSV files. It just makes things easier to find, because you might work on it one day, come back 2-3 days later, and not exactly remember where is what. So having this kind of folder structure helps me, at least. And because we have named the query fields to match exactly the Salesforce fields, then this auto match functionality really works well. You don't need to drag and drop and define the mapping yourself. And I end up saving the mapping because I know that within 2 clicks, I can do it with the auto match. So a little time-saving trick. As we know, we get the success and error files, and then we can again import the results back into Access to be able to do matching, to be able to update and get that, let's say, account ID here, to map it from the legacy account ID to the Salesforce account ID. And I'll show you this in an example. And that's the results. Basically getting that Salesforce ID and your legacy ID, and now you can do all the mapping that you need. I talked a bit about this already. You always want to do parent tables before you do child tables. So we talked about that and how to, I'll show you through example, how to make sure you specify that account ID. So this ends up being your final process. You have the same steps we saw before. We had the legacy database, the CSV file. We have our table, transform and query. We've got 2 types of queries, right? One base for the child, one base for the parent. And then when you load data into Salesforce, you have that success CSV file, which you will basically reload back into Access as a success table to be able to continue the manipulations and the mapping. And that's the same thing, but written in words, just in case you wanted to. And what's great about this process is that you can repeat it for any kind of complexity. You can have as many parent-child relationships as you want. I know, for example, field service and CPQ have a very data-driven architecture, and I've had no problem loading all of these components, the skills and the operating hours and your price, product features and product options, all within Salesforce using this process. Any questions about importing into Salesforce? It's a lot of talking. My mouth is getting parched. The demo is next, of course. Oh, we're actually getting close to time as well. I was hoping to keep your time. So let me get your feedback. We have 15 minutes. It's probably enough time to do this. It takes about 10, 15 minutes to do it. So would you rather me show you the demo now or pause here and pick it up on Thursday? Quick show of hands or quick comments, please, if you would, in the chat room. I need to know what you prefer. Show demo, demo. Okay, cool. Let's do that then. I want to make sure I respect your time. So I'll do as fast as I can go within reason. So the first thing I do to export is I right-click on the query that I want to export. I click on Export, and I pick Text File. And here is where I browse for my particular folder. So here I'm in the Data folder, which is where I got my inputs. I'm going to the Import folder for the importing into Salesforce. Make sure it is CSV file. Here's where I go through the similar process as we did for the import, where we're picking the options. We want delimited. We want a comma separating the two. We want that double quotes, and we want the first names to be included as well. And here also is when I jump to advanced. Make sure I pick my UTF-8 as always. Next, confirm, finish, and then save those steps to repeat in a future iteration. Pretty straightforward. I'll do the same thing for contact. It remembers my file, my folder name, so I just need to change it here. A little quick cheat. Next, this, UTF-8. And again, I mean, obviously there are some files that don't have any accents at all. Like if you have only a table with IDs, I just get into the habit of UTF-8. This way I never forget. I always do it. Yeah. Save, finish, done. All right. So now I've got my two files. Let's load them into Salesforce. Specifically, what matters most actually is the account, because I want to make sure that when I'm loading the contact, I have that account ID. So here's where I pull up my data loader. I do my insert. We're going to do account first, 01. Go to my import. And I'm sure you guys have done this many times, so I'll blow through this pretty quickly. You can see I've got 1,000 records. I do my mapping, auto map. Everything's done for me. And I kept the legacy ID here on purpose, and you'll see why in a few minutes. I don't bother saving the mapping because it's too easy anyway. Click on next. Make sure my output files are in that results subfolder. Yes, yes, yes. Let's go. Looking good. One error. What is the error? Duplicate. We don't really care. It's a demo. Normally, of course, I'd fix that before we move on to the next stage. For now, we'll just forget about it. Pretend it didn't happen. So I go to here, check out my results. What I like to do is I like to rename these things as well. For the success, I like to rename it into the object so that I can refer to it later on. It's always good to have. Yeah, and now we want to be able to take that result file and bring it back into Salesforce to do the mapping. So I'm going to do the same kind of import. I'll go a bit quicker this time. Go to my results, import account. Step through these pretty quickly. Next, next, next. UTF-8. I don't care about primary keys. And we can call it account because it really is a type of account that came from Salesforce. So now what matters most, what I only care about are these first two columns. I don't really care about the rest of the columns. We could use them if we wanted to, but I don't. I just look at these two because that's what I care about. And the idea here, and the reason why we had that legacy ID, is with this legacy ID, we can match to the legacy ID of our actual table to be able to populate this field. Let me show you how I would do that. Query. I basically pull in the legacy account and the account. I match the two based on legacy ID. And the field that I want to update is the ID on the legacy account. So I show this, and let me just show this to you quickly. I'll bring in all those 4 fields. So you can see the first two are from the table I want to modify, and here are the output files, the success files that I got. So we can see it matches, and I'm going to be basically copying this value into here. Because the idea is I don't care so much about the account table itself. I'm going to delete it after. And I want to have a single table which has all my account records in it.
Alex, Vikram asked a question.
Did you push? So I didn't. So the answer is no. You may want to. Depending on your instance, your situation, you may want to store that legacy ID in Salesforce. And it makes total sense in many cases to be able to refer to it, for the client to refer to it through a lookup. Not through a lookup, but through an external field. Let's say, for example, they have a client number or a legacy account code, and they want to find that in Salesforce, and they don't know the name of it because they refer to it by a particular code. It makes total sense to take that legacy ID and save it in a custom field in Salesforce, and then call it or refer to it as an external field for searching purposes. For this example, I didn't bother. It's unnecessary. I don't need to do it. It's just for an example, but there are use cases where you do want to save that legacy ID in Salesforce. It's a good question. So the idea here is I had the legacy ID stored in the output query of my account, of the account. So when I loaded it into Salesforce, it didn't find a match because the legacy ID doesn't exist in Salesforce as a field, but it still keeps it in the file so that when data loader creates that success file, let me show you, it still has that legacy ID. So it just kind of just carries it along and ignores it. And that's what allows me to be able to import this back into Salesforce and do this mapping. Cool. Yes, exactly. Imported the success file. So now that I've imported that success file, renamed it as account, I'm now mapping it back to the account ID to account ID. And what I'm going to do, you'll see before I'll do it, is I'm basically saying, so match on the account on the legacy ID, and I want to update the ID on the legacy account, because right now, if I go back to legacy account, you'll see it's all blank. I want to update this field based on this field by matching on legacy ID. So I matched on legacy ID. I specify the field that I want to update. It's going to be field. I change the query type. Hey, where's my query type? That's cool. I don't see it. Yeah, here it is. Wrong tab. I go to the design tab of the query, and I change the query type. And I say, I'm going to make this an update query because I'm going to update this particular record. And I'm going to update it to account ID. You can see Access is automatically putting in those square parentheses. So I'll repeat before I do this. I'm taking the success file that I got from from Salesforce, which has both the ID and the legacy ID, and I'm going to be updating the legacy account by matching on the legacy ID and updating this ID with that ID. And when I click on Run, you'll see 999 records being updated. Good to go. And now I can just close all of this because that's done. It's a one-time shot. And if you see, if I go back to legacy ID, it's now been populated. At this point, I'll just close all this. So at this point, legacy ID is populated with that ID we just got. I no longer need account. It served its purpose as a mapping file, so I delete it. Now, I delete it just for cleaning purposes, because if you have too many tables, too many queries that you used for one time and one time only, it'll create too much junk and distract you. So only keep the stuff that matters to you that you're going to use a second time. So now if I go back to my contact, you'll see that the legacy ID, through virtue of updating that account, legacy account, I now have all my account IDs for my contact. So I can now export contact. Make sure it's in the right folder. It's going to go to data import, contact. It confirms I'm overwriting a file, which I didn't need. Same thing, comma, double quotes, include file name. Make sure I'm UTF-8. Save the steps. And now I can go ahead and insert the contacts using that record, that file. 64, we found, remember 64 we're matching, which is fine for this demo. Do my auto match, next, and import the results. Pretty cool. So that is the demo for loading into Salesforce. So like I mentioned before, it can get quite advanced. You can do all kinds of different permutations of this. I skimmed the surface on what you can do, but it hopefully gave you a nugget of what is possible. At this point, we got 6 minutes left. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them for today. If not, we'll be able to pause here for the day and pick it up again on Thursday, talking about code. Don't forget as well, if you do have any use cases you want to give me, I'm happy to do it. Just send it my way, email it to me at alex@dryad consulting, and I'll be happy to demo it in the next session, because this session had a little more material, and I wanted to stop it at this point because up until now, as I'm sure you've noticed, there's been no code. Versus the next session will be much more code, much more advanced topics, which not everyone might be interested in doing. So this way you have everything today that has to do with just clicks, and you can do quite a bit. So yeah, let me know if there are more user stories or cases you want me to handle, talk about, or review anything else. I'll be happy to do that starting at the beginning of next session. Multiple accounts, yeah, that's a good one. Case and multiple accounts, tables from various systems. So if you can give me some sample data, Dan, I'll be happy to do that for you. If you can give it to me either today or tomorrow, it'd be better to give me a first crack at it, so I don't do it absolutely live with you on Thursday. But I will show you the resolution of that live. Deployment to multiple orgs, how to plan the process using this. That's a good question too. Because the structure stays the same. Everything you build once, assuming that all the orgs are similar or identical, the structure that you build can be used once. And it's just a matter now of importing, exporting the data to and from Salesforce. Because let's say I assume you have one, yeah, IDs are different, exactly, Vikram. So the idea is that your source data might be the same. So you can get everything into Access, you can build all your queries, you can do all your checks and balances. And then, for example, because the account ID is going to be different, you can't obviously load the contacts until the accounts are ready. So all you're basically doing in that second org is first loading the accounts, getting that success table, inputting it back into Access to be able to get the new accounts for this contact, and repeat, repeat, repeat. So you just have to maybe clean the data between each instance, because right now I have the ID here of our first instance. I'd have to remove this column, blank it out, update it to blank, and then run it again for that second org. If you want, I can show you a bit more of an example on that next time as well. I'll take a note of that. Junction tables, yeah, sure. That's a great example as well. If you can give me any example, if you can think of an example that's relevant to you, I'll be happy to do that as well. The basic idea is that you first, if you have a junction table between two tables, you first do those two tables, and then you do the junction object. But I'll be happy to show that to you if you can give me some examples, either sample data and or sample objects to work with. Yeah, that's a great one. Thanks, Derek. All right, last moment for anybody to ask anything at this time. If not, again, there'll be more than enough time in the next session. All right, well, listen, thank you very much for attending. And let me know how you give me some feedback. Let me know how I'm doing, my pace. If you want me to go a bit faster, a bit slower, if everything is good, I'm really happy to receive your feedback. This was fun. I really enjoyed it. I hope you learned something along the way as well. Yeah, I'll give you my email address. I'll type it in here so you guys don't need to copy and paste it. Grab it from there. And on that note, I'll see you guys on Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern. Thanks very much. Oh, I just saw that question, Rohit. So yeah, everything will be sent to you at the end of on Thursday. Whether you attend or not on Thursday, I'll send it to everyone on Thursday with a link to both recordings, because I'll put it into Dropbox or something like that. And I'll give you guys a PDF of the presentation, the links to the video files, and the sample Access database with my source code in it. Thanks.